First time I understood what my grandmother had actually done for me, I was standing in the middle of a catered reception with a glass of sparkling water in my hand, watching my father's face go from triumphant to the specific shade of pale that means someone realizes they have miscalculated badly. He'd told me to leave. Use those exact words, "you need to leave right now," through a tight smile so the people nearby wouldn't hear. And I'd smiled back at him and said, "I'm not going anywhere, Dad, but someone else is." That was 6 months ago. Let me go back to the beginning because none of it makes sense without the beginning. My grandmother, my father's mother, Grandma Ruthie, was the kind of woman who kept her important papers in a fireproof lockbox under her bed and never told anyone the combination except me. She said I was the only one in the family who didn't look at her like a balance sheet. I didn't really understand what she meant when I was younger. I do now. She passed 2 years ago, in October, quietly, the way she'd lived. She left behind a modest house in Denton, a collection of ceramic owls I now keep on my kitchen shelf, and a trust that had been set up in my name when I was 7 years old. She'd funded it herself over the years, never making a big deal about it, never mentioning it at holidays. I only found out it existed when her attorney, Mr. Beaumont, called me 3 days after the funeral. The trust was structured to be managed by a trustee until I turned 32. I was 29 at the time. My father was named trustee. I remember thinking that was fine, normal even. He was her son. He was a financial advisor by profession. It made sense on paper, and I had no reason then to think it wouldn't be fine. That's the thing about being gaslit slowly. You don't feel the temperature rising. My brother, let's call him what he was to everyone in that house, the golden one, had always been the point of the family's ambitions. He's 4 years older than me, charming in the way that gets you excused from consequences, and he'd spent the better part of his 30s trying to launch a bourbon label out of Nashville. I'm not being unkind when I say the business had failed twice already. I'm just being accurate. My parents believed in him the way some families believe in a religion. Every setback was reframed as a setup for something bigger. Every check they wrote was called an investment. My mother once told me, and I am not exaggerating, that his taste level alone was worth funding. I had a different relationship with my parents' expectations. I was a paralegal at a mid-size firm in Austin. I liked my job, I was good at it. I wasn't launching anything or disrupting any industry, and my parents had made their peace with that in the particular way that means they hadn't made their peace with it at all. I wasn't looking for trouble. I wasn't watching for signs. I was just living my life. The first crack appeared 18 months after Grandma Ruthie died when I went to refinance my car loan and my credit report came back flagged. There was a signature loan on there. $15,000 opened 14 months earlier that I had absolutely no memory of taking out. I sat in the credit union's parking lot for a long time before I drove home. I told myself it was a clerical error. I filed a dispute. I assumed it would sort itself out. It didn't sort itself out. 3 months later, I got a letter from a CPA I'd never heard of, referencing a Schedule K-1 for a limited partnership I allegedly had a stake in. The partnership was called Copper Barrel Holdings. I had never heard of Copper Barrel Holdings, but my brother's bourbon label was called Copper Barrel Reserve. I stared at that letter for a long time. I still didn't call a lawyer. I know that sounds hard to believe in retrospect, but I want to be honest about this part. When the people doing something to you are your parents, your brain works very hard to find a different explanation. You don't want to be the person who accuses their own father of something that serious. You find reasons to wait. I called my father instead. I told him about the K-1. I asked what it was. He didn't miss a beat. He said Grandma Ruthie had wanted to diversify the trust's holdings and that he'd made some adjustments in his capacity as trustee. He said he should have told me sooner. It was an oversight. Everything was completely legitimate. He said the words completely legitimate the way someone says them when they've practiced saying them. I said, okay. I said I understood. I hung up the phone and sat very still. That was my mistake. The one I come to think about later when I read comments from strangers telling me what I should have done differently. They were right. I should have stopped talking to him then. I showed my hand before I had a full picture of what was in his. The second mistake I almost made was telling my mother. I called her 2 days later. half hoping she wouldn't know anything about it, half hoping she'd have a clean explanation that would make it all make sense. She didn't give me either. She gave me something worse. She sighed and said I needed to understand that my brother was at a critical juncture and that the family had to come together to support him, and that Grandma Ruthie had always wanted her grandchildren to thrive. She used my grandmother's name to explain why money from my grandmother's trust had been moved without my knowledge into my brother's failing company. I said, "Mom, that's not what a trust works. He's the trustee, not the owner. That money is mine," she said. "I know you've always felt like things were unfair." I didn't argue with her. I got off the phone, and I started making calls that actually mattered. The attorney I found was a woman named Ms. Thornburg, who had an office above a Vietnamese restaurant on South Congress and a reputation that did not match her modest surroundings. She specialized in trust and estate litigation, and when I walked in and laid out what I knew, she leaned back in her chair and said, "Give me 2 weeks." What she found in 2 weeks was this: over 14 months. My father had made 4 distributions from the trust, totaling just under $68,000. 3 of those distributions were routed through a holding company into Copper Barrel Holdings, LLC, which was my brother's bourbon label restructured after its second failure. The 4th distribution appeared to have been used to cover a balloon payment on my parents' home equity line of credit. None of these distributions had been made for my benefit. None had been disclosed to me as required under the terms of the trust. My father had also signed a promissory note on my behalf. That was the $15,000 signature loan on my credit report, which he had apparently used to fund startup inventory for my brother's 3rd attempt at launching the label. He had signed my name on a financial instrument, without my knowledge, without my consent. Miss Thornburg said it plainly: this is breach of fiduciary duty, fraud, and depending on how the DA's office wants to look at the promissory note, forgery. I asked her what we should do. She said, "First, you don't say another word to your father about any of this. Second, we send a formal demand letter and we simultaneously file a complaint with the state. Third, we wait for them to make a mistake." I asked if they would make a mistake. She said, "People who have been doing something they know is wrong for over a year always make a mistake when they realize someone's looking." They made 2. The first was that my father hired a family friend, a therapist who had treated my mother for anxiety about 8 years prior, to write a letter suggesting that I had a history of financial paranoia and was prone to misinterpreting professional decisions as personal attacks. The letter mentioned, with what I'm sure someone thought was helpful specificity, that I had exhibited signs of anxiety disorder and was likely acting from a place of emotional dysregulation rather than legitimate grievance. My father had somehow obtained records from therapy sessions I'd attended after a bad breakup at 26. I don't know precisely how. Miss Thornburg said it didn't matter how, because the use of those records the way they'd used them was actionable in its own right, and that the letter would look to a judge exactly like what it was: an attempt to discredit a beneficiary before she could make her case. When I first read that letter, sitting at Miss Thornburg's conference table, my hands were shaking, not from fear, from something I can only describe as a very cold, very clarifying kind of rage, because I recognized the language in it. It sounded like things my mother had been saying to me my entire life. It sounded like every time I'd pushed back on something and been told I was too sensitive, too intense, too difficult. They hadn't just stolen money from me. They'd been building the story for years. The second mistake was the invitation. My brother had finally done it, gotten the bourbon label off the ground on his 3rd try, probably because he'd had $60-something thousand worth of help he hadn't disclosed to his investors. He was throwing a launch event at a venue in the Pearl District in San Antonio, a proper party, a bartender, canapes, a photo wall with the Copper Barrel logo. He invited my parents. He invited their friends. He invited their friends. He invited people from the industry. My mother called me and asked if I was coming. I think she was testing the temperature. I said of course I was. I wouldn't miss it. I could hear the relief in her voice. She thought I decided to let it go. What I'd actually decided was to let Ms. Thornburg do what she did best. The week before the launch event, she filed the civil suit. She also filed a formal complaint with the Texas State Securities Board regarding the undisclosed funding of Copper Barrel Holdings, which had outside investors who had not been told about the trust distributions. That part, she told me, would get attention from people with badges. She also contacted an investigator at the IRS field office. The promissory note my father had signed in my name was connected to a financial institution, and the way it had been structured created questions about his tax filings. I didn't sleep much that week. I want to be honest about that too. None of this felt like victory. It felt like something you do because the alternative is letting people who love you or who were supposed to love you believe that what they did was acceptable, that you're the kind of person who can be moved around and documented and diagnosed into silence. I went to the launch party in a dark green wrap dress that my grandmother would have liked. I drove myself. I did not tell anyone else in my family I was coming. The venue was nice. My brother had good taste, I'll give him that. String lights, exposed brick, small batch bourbon in branded glasses. About 40 people, some I recognized and some I didn't. My mother saw me first, and her expression did something complicated, went through relief, then uncertainty, then something she tried to flatten into a smile. My father found me about 10 minutes in near the drink table. He put his hand on my arm and said quietly, "I'm really glad you came. I think this is the right thing for the family." I said, "I think so too." He relaxed. I excused myself to say hello to my brother, who was working the room with the ease of someone who has never once worried about the bill coming due. He hugged me. He said he was glad things seemed better between us. I said I was sure everything would be resolved soon. About 20 minutes later, 2 men in suits came through the front door. They spoke briefly to the venue manager, showed something I couldn't see from across the room, and asked to speak with my father and brother. The event didn't stop immediately. It just got very quiet in one corner, and then the quiet spread. My father saw me across the room at the exact moment he understood. He said my name, just my name. Not in anger. There was no room for anger yet, it was too fast for that. He said my name the way you say it when the thing you thought couldn't happen is happening anyway. I didn't respond. I finished my drink. I set the glass down carefully on a cocktail napkin. He said, "You did this. You do this to your own family." I said, "You signed my name on a loan, Dad. You moved $68,000 that belonged to me and you didn't tell me. That's what you did to your own family." He said, "You'd embarrass us over money? After everything we've done for you?" I said, "I haven't said a word to anyone in this room. Everything that's happening right now is happening because of what you chose to do." My mother appeared at his elbow. Her face had gone very still. She looked older, suddenly, in the string lights. I picked up my bag. I didn't make a scene. I watched to my car, and I sat in it for about 10 minutes before I could drive, and I cried, not from regret, just from the weight of it, the sheer accumulated weight of loving people who used that love as a material they could work with. The civil suit was settled 8 months later. My father's attorney advised him not to take it to trial, which tells you something about how the evidence looked. The settlement restored the trust in full. The $68,000 plus interest, plus the promissory note was discharged and the credit entry removed from my report. My father also agreed to resign as trustee, and the court appointed an independent successor who would manage the remaining distributions until I turned 32. The Securities Board investigation resulted in a separate proceeding involving the outside investors in Copper Barrel Holdings who had not been told their money was being pooled alongside trust funds obtained through undisclosed fiduciary transactions. My brother cooperated with that investigation. I don't know the full terms of what he agreed to. I know the bourbon label is no longer operating. My father was not criminally charged. Miss Thornburn told me the DA's office had reviewed the forgery question and decided the civil resolution was sufficient. I'll be honest, I had complicated feelings about that, but she reminded me that the civil case was always going to give me what I actually needed, which was my money back and documentation of what had happened. The therapist's letter became part of the civil record. My attorney added a defamation claim based on the distribution of that letter to my father's attorney and to my brother prior to any litigation, and that claim was folded into the settlement. I don't speak to my parents. That's not a dramatic decision, I announced. It's just what happened when the calls stopped coming and I stopped making them. I think my mother believes I'll eventually come around. She may be waiting a long time. What I keep coming back to in the months since is my grandmother. She'd set up that trust when I was 7 years old. She'd funded it from her own savings steadily over 25 years. She hadn't told me about it in any specific way, just said once that she wanted to make sure I had options. I used to think that was just a thing grandmothers say. Now I understand she was saying it with precision. She also, as it turned out, had written a letter to Mr. Beaumont, her attorney, to be opened only if a dispute ever arose involving the trust. She hadn't mentioned a camera. The letter simply said that she had observed over many years a pattern in the family's treatment of me, and that she had specifically structured the trust to prevent my father from having unchecked access to its assets, and that if he had been named trustee at all, it was only because changing that detail after a certain point would have prompted questions she didn't want to prompt. She had known. She had known, and she had done what she could with the tools she had, and she had picked an attorney she trusted to hold the letter until it was needed. When Mr. Beaumont read it to me over the phone, I sat down on my kitchen floor. I didn't cry. I just sat there with the phone in my hand and the ceramic owls on the shelf above me and thought about how much it is possible to love someone and never find quite the right moment to tell them. I'm 31 now. The trust will pass to me outright next year. The balance, restored and modestly grown, is enough to do something real with, not something lavish, just something that's mine. I've thought about going back to school. I've thought about buying a small piece of land outside the city. I've thought about a lot of things. What I know is this. My grandmother spent 25 years quietly making sure I would be okay. The least I can do is be okay. I'm working on it. I've thought a lot about what it actually takes for something like this to unravel the way it did. People want it to be dramatic, a single moment of courage, one phone call that changed everything. It wasn't like that. It was slow, and it was unglamorous, and most of it happened in parking lots and conference rooms and on hold with government agencies. But here's what I've come to understand. The whole thing only worked because my father believed, completely, that I would not push back. He had 29 years of evidence that I absorbed things quietly and moved on. He wasn't wrong about my history. He was wrong about my limit. That's the part nobody tells you about people who take advantage of the ones closest to them. They're not calculating in a cold, strategic way. They're just counting on patterns holding. They count on love being a reason to let things go, and for a long time it is, until it isn't. I don't think my father is an evil person in some absolute sense. I think he wanted something from my brother badly enough that he stopped asking whether it was his to give. That's a different kind of failure. Not malice exactly, but a willingness to look away from what you're doing when the thing you want is close enough to touch. My mother's failure was quieter and in some ways harder for me to process because hers was the failure of someone who saw it and found a language for why it was okay. What I keep returning to is Ms. Thornbird sitting across from me at that conference table saying, "Document everything, say nothing, let them move first." That was the smartest thing anyone told me through the whole of it. Not because strategy is more important than feeling. I had plenty of feelings. I cried on my kitchen floor more than once. But because grief and rage without direction just become noise. The discipline of doing the right next thing, even when you're shaking, is its own kind of strength. It doesn't feel heroic. It feels like making another phone call when you'd rather fall apart. And Grandma Ruthie. I keep coming back to her too. She didn't leave me a speech or a warning. She left me an attorney she trusted and a letter sealed in an envelope that only got opened because someone did exactly what she worried they might do. She had no guarantee it would work out. She just did what she could with the information she had and the time she had left, and she trusted that I would find my way to the rest. That's what I want to carry forward from all of this, not the settlement figure, not the satisfaction of watching my father's face change at that party. What I want to carry is the version of myself that kept going when it would have been so much easier to decide it wasn't worth the fight. The version that picked an attorney over a confrontation. The version that wore a dark green dress to a launch party and didn't say a single unnecessary word. You don't have to be fearless to do the right thing. You just have to be willing to do the next right thing even when your hands are shaking. I'm still learning that, but I'm learning it.